The hills of Gaul were silent, but not empty. From the ridges above, thousands of unseen eyes watched the Roman camp below. Fires flickered in the darkness like scattered stars fallen to earth. Within those walls of timber and sharpened stakes, the army of Julius Caesar waited, surrounded, not by one enemy, but by two. Inside the fortified hilltop city of Alesia, tens of thousands of Gauls starved slowly, their last hope fading with each passing night. Outside, beyond the Roman lines, an even greater force gathered in the shadows, a relief army, vast and desperate, marching to break the siege. Rome had become the hunted, caught between a fortress that refused to fall, and an army that refused to stop coming. And yet Caesar did something unthinkable. He ordered his men to build walls, not one wall, but two. One to trap the enemy within, and another to keep the world out. It was a gamble born of arrogance or brilliance, because if either side broke through, the Roman army would be annihilated, trapped, crushed, erased from history. What followed at Alesia was not simply a siege. It was a slow tightening of death, starvation, desperation, betrayal, and a final brutal collision that would decide the fate of Gaul and the future of Rome itself. The story of Alesia begins long before the first Roman trench was dug into the cold earth of Gaul. For years, Julius Caesar had waged a relentless campaign across the region, a war that would later be remembered as the Gallic Wars. Tribe after tribe had fallen beneath Roman discipline. Villages burned. Entire populations were enslaved or scattered. What Caesar called conquest, others would remember as devastation. But Gaul was not yet broken. From the ashes of defeat, a leader emerged who would unite the fractured tribes into something Rome had not yet faced. A single, coordinated resistance. His name was Vercingetorix. He was young, charismatic, and dangerously intelligent. Where other leaders had fought Rome directly and been crushed, Vercingetorix chose a different strategy. He would deny Caesar the one thing Roman armies depended on: supply. Crops were burned. Villages were abandoned. Wells were poisoned. The land itself became a weapon. Roman soldiers marched through territory stripped bare, forced to stretch their supply lines dangerously thin. Hunger began to creep into the Roman ranks, an invisible enemy that could not be defeated with swords. For a time, it worked. Caesar's advance slowed. His army, though still formidable, was no longer invincible. But Vercingetorix made one critical decision that would shape everything that followed. After a series of maneuvers, he retreated with his forces into a fortified hilltop settlement, Alesia. The location seemed perfect. Surrounded by natural defenses with high ground overlooking the plains, Alesia appeared nearly impossible to assault. From its walls, the Gauls could observe every Roman movement. Supplies, though limited, were initially sufficient. And most importantly, Vercingetorix was not alone. He sent messengers across Gaul, calling for a massive relief force to gather and break the siege once it began. When Caesar arrived and saw the position, he understood immediately. A direct assault would be suicidal. The Gauls held the advantage of height and fortification. Attacking uphill against determined defenders would cost thousands of Roman lives, perhaps more than the army could afford. So Caesar chose patience. He would not storm Alesia. He would strangle it. Roman soldiers began constructing an enormous ring of fortifications around the city. Trenches were dug deep into the soil. Wooden palisades rose from the earth like a jagged crown. Towers were built at intervals, manned by archers and artillery. Hidden traps, sharpened stakes buried in pits, were scattered across the approaches. This inner wall, known as the circumvallation, sealed Alesia off from the outside world. No food could enter. No messenger could escape. But Caesar knew something even more dangerous than the city itself was coming: the relief army. Somewhere beyond the horizon, tens of thousands of Gauls were gathering, answering Vercingetorix's call. When they arrived, the Roman army would be trapped between two enemies, one inside, one outside. Most commanders would have retreated before that moment came. Caesar did the opposite. He ordered the construction of a second wall, facing outward, a mirror of the first. This outer fortification, the contravallation, turned the Roman position into a fortress surrounded on both sides. Inside the ring, Alesia starved. Outside, the approaching Gauls would find themselves facing an army already prepared for their arrival. The scale of the construction was staggering. Miles of trenches, walls, and defensive structures encircled the battlefield. Roman soldiers worked day and night, driven by discipline and the knowledge that failure meant annihilation. As the walls rose, the reality inside Alesia began to darken. Supplies dwindled quickly, food became scarce. Hunger gnawed at the population, not just warriors but families, children, the elderly. At first, rations were reduced, then they were rationed again. Eventually, there was simply not enough. Ancient accounts describe a grim decision. Those who could not fight would be expelled from the city. One morning, the gates of Alesia opened and a silent procession emerged. Women, children, the old. They walked slowly toward the Roman lines, weak from hunger, hoping for mercy. But none came. Caesar refused to let them pass. Allowing them through would mean feeding them, something the Roman army could not afford. And so they were trapped between the walls, not allowed back into Alesia, not allowed into the Roman camp. They lingered in that space, slowly dying of starvation, their presence a haunting reminder of the cost of this war. Meanwhile, in the distance, the relief army finally arrived. Tens of thousands of warriors flooded the hills surrounding Alesia. Their numbers dwarfed the Roman force. For the first time, Caesar's army faced the very real possibility of total destruction. Signals were sent to the city. Coordinated attacks began. From within Alesia, Vercingetorix launched assaults against the inner wall. At the same time, the relief army struck the outer defenses. The Romans were attacked from both sides, exactly as feared. The battlefield became chaos. Trumpets blared. Arrows darkened the sky. Waves of Gauls crashed against Roman fortifications, climbing ladders, filling trenches with bodies to create makeshift bridges. Inside the walls, Roman soldiers fought desperately, rotating between the inner and outer defenses as needed. Every man knew there was nowhere to retreat. If the lines broke, they would be surrounded and slaughtered. Caesar himself moved along the defenses, directing troops, reinforcing weak points. His presence a constant force holding the army together. The fighting did not end in a single day. It dragged on, attack after attack, each one testing the limits of Roman endurance. And with every failed assault, desperation grew. By the time the final phase of the siege began, the land around Alesia had become something unrecognizable. What had once been open countryside was now a scarred battlefield, torn earth, broken bodies, and the looming presence of Roman fortifications stretching across the hills like a prison without escape. Inside the city, starvation had hollowed the defenders. Outside, the relief army grew restless, knowing time was slipping away, and between them stood the army of Julius Caesar, outnumbered, surrounded, and refusing to yield. The Gauls understood that scattered assaults would not be enough. They needed one decisive blow, a coordinated attack powerful enough to shatter the Roman lines in a single moment, and so they prepared for it. Under the cover of darkness, the relief army moved into position, studying the Roman defenses, searching for weakness. They found it in the terrain. One section of the Roman fortifications, built across uneven ground, was less secure than the rest. The walls there were harder to reinforce, the trenches less effective. It was the perfect place to strike. At dawn, the assault began. From outside the Roman lines, thousands of Gauls surged forward, their cries rolling across the hills like thunder. They advanced in waves, carrying ladders, hooks, and raw determination. At the same moment, inside Alesia, Vercingetorix ordered his forces to attack. The Romans were hit from both sides again. But this time, it was different. This time, the attacks were synchronized. The outer defenses shook under the weight of the assault. Gauls poured into trenches, sacrificing themselves to fill the gaps so others could cross. Ladders slammed against the walls. Roman defenders fought desperately, stabbing downward, pushing attackers back. But the sheer number of enemies made it almost impossible to hold every position. At the same time, the inner wall came under relentless pressure. Starving Gauls, driven by desperation rather than strategy, threw themselves at the fortifications. They had nothing left to lose. Behind them lay hunger. Ahead of them, a chance, however slim, to break free. The Roman lines began to falter. In one critical sector, the outer defenses nearly collapsed. Gauls breached parts of the fortifications, flooding into areas that should have been secure. Panic spread among the Roman soldiers stationed there. For a brief, terrifying moment, it seemed the entire structure might unravel. If that happened, the consequences would be immediate. The relief army would break through. The defenders of Alesia would pour out. And the Roman army would be trapped in a tightening circle of death. Caesar saw the danger. Without hesitation, he gathered a reserve force. Elite cavalry and infantry held back for exactly this moment. Mounting his horse, he rode directly toward the collapsing section of the line. Ancient accounts describe the scene with a sense of urgency bordering on myth. Dust filled the air. Screams echoed across the battlefield. And through it all, Caesar appeared at the front, his red cloak visible to his soldiers. A signal, a symbol, a reminder that they were not yet defeated. He ordered a counterattack. Roman cavalry swept around the flanks of the attacking Gauls, striking them from the side. Infantry reinforced the weakened positions, pushing back against the breach with renewed intensity. The fighting turned savage, close and chaotic. There was no room for formation, no space for strategy, only survival. Blades rose and fell in a blur. Men slipped in blood-soaked earth. The air filled with the metallic scent of death. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, the momentum shifted. The Gauls, who had seemed unstoppable moments before, began to lose cohesion. The Roman counterattack, precise and relentless, drove into their flanks, disrupting their advance. Confusion spread through their ranks. And then, they began to fall back. What had been a unified assault dissolved into retreat. From the walls, Roman soldiers pressed the advantage, pushing the attackers further away from the fortifications. The relief army, unable to break through, began to withdraw. Inside Alesia, the defenders saw it happening. Their last hope was leaving. The realization spread like a shadow through the city. The coordinated assault had failed. The relief army, their salvation, was retreating into the distance. The Romans still stood, and now there was nothing left. No food, no reinforcements. No escape, only the certainty of what would come next. The following day, the gates of Alesia opened once more. But this time, there was no desperate procession of civilians. There was silence. From the city emerged Vercingetorix, mounted on horseback, dressed in his finest armor. He rode slowly toward the Roman lines, alone. Ancient writers would later describe the moment with a kind of solemn reverence. Vercingetorix circled Caesar, dismounted, and laid down his weapons at the Roman general's feet. A gesture not just of surrender, but of finality. The siege was over. Alesia had fallen. The rebellion in Gaul, once so powerful, was broken. The surviving defenders were captured. Many would be sold into slavery. Others would be executed. The city itself would never again rise as it had before. As for Vercingetorix, his fate was sealed the moment he surrendered. He would be taken to Rome, held in captivity for years, and eventually executed in a triumph celebrating Caesar's victory. The man who had nearly united Gaul, reduced to a symbol of Rome's dominance. The siege of Alesia did more than end a rebellion. It marked the moment Gaul ceased to be a collection of independent peoples and became a possession of Rome. For Julius Caesar, it was a triumph that would echo far beyond the battlefield. His victory secured his reputation as one of Rome's greatest generals, a man capable of achieving the impossible through sheer will and calculation. But it also set him on a path that would lead to something far darker, the collapse of the Roman Republic itself. Because the same army that had survived Alesia would one day follow him across the Rubicon. The same loyalty forged in desperation and blood would be turned against Rome. And in that sense, Alesia was not just an ending, it was a beginning. A moment when one man proved that, with enough ambition and enough control over an army, the fate of entire nations could be decided. The hills of Alesia are quiet now, the walls are gone, the trenches filled. But beneath that silence lies the memory of a place where thousands starved, where hope was crushed between two armies, and where the future of Rome was sealed in blood. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The sound of a world being conquered